Don't ever come back here. I never want to see you again.
Son kicked his mom, making her fall to her knees at the door. But she was hiding $1,200,000. Helena Santos watched the Sunday afternoon through the window of her house, her fingers still aching from the sewing work she had finished hours before. The house was modest, but well kept, with quality furniture that lasted decades, always impeccably clean, each object in its place. The smell of cornmeal cake was still present in the kitchen, a reminder of the preparations to receive her son and daughter-in-law. At 65, Helena maintained the routine she had built over decades, waking up early to tend to the small garden, preparing simple but plentiful meals, sewing clothes for neighbors who still sought her services even after her retirement. The wall clock showed 3 in the afternoon when she heard the car parking in front, and her heart filled with that maternal expectation that had never diminished, even in the face of the growing disappointments that Roberto caused her. She smoothed her clean apron, checked if the table was well arranged, and walked to the door with the smile she always reserved for her only son. "They've arrived," she whispered to herself, feeling that mixture of joy and apprehension that had become common during the monthly visits. Roberto got out of the car with a closed expression, slamming the door harder than necessary, while Patricia followed a few steps behind with a tired look. Helena immediately noticed the tension in the air, that heavy atmosphere that preceded arguments, but opened the door with the same welcoming smile as always. "My son, how good that you've arrived," she said tenderly, opening her arms for a hug that Roberto completely ignored. He walked right past her, entering the living room with heavy steps, his eyes scanning the environment with that look of dissatisfaction that had become his trademark. Patricia at least offered a quick kiss on Helena's cheek, muttering a greeting without enthusiasm, before following her husband inside. Helena closed the door slowly, that familiar weight settling in her chest, and followed the two to the living room, where Roberto had already thrown himself on the sofa with an air of ownership. "I prepared cornmeal cake, the way you liked it as a child," she offered in a soft voice, trying to break the ice. The silence that followed was interrupted only by Roberto's impatient sigh, who looked at his mother with hard, cold eyes. "Mom, we need to talk," Roberto began, his voice laden with poorly disguised irritation, as he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Helena sat in the opposite armchair, hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain the calm she had learned to cultivate over the years. She knew that tone, that way of speaking that preceded demands, complaints, requirements that had become increasingly frequent since Roberto had married Patricia and opened his small digital printing shop, a business he had insisted on expanding beyond his capacity to manage. "The print shop isn't doing well," he continued, running his hand through his hair with a nervous gesture. "I bought that industrial printer that I said would revolutionize everything, but the big contracts didn't come. I have debts, many debts with paper and equipment suppliers, and I need money urgently." Helena felt her stomach tighten, but maintained the serene expression she had practiced so much in the face of life's difficulties. She knew this moment would come, like so many others over the last 10 years, since Roberto had begun to see her only as a source of resources. "How much do you need this time, son?" she asked in a tired voice, already knowing that any amount she offered would be considered insufficient. Roberto's response came quick and hard as a slap. $15,000. He fired without hesitation, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that bordered on aggressiveness. Helena felt the world spin for a moment, that absurd amount echoing in her mind like an alarm bell. Her pension was $800 a month, sufficient for her simple but comfortable life, and the checking account that Roberto knew about contained no more than $3,000 saved for medical emergencies. "Roberto, you know I don't have that money," she began with a trembling voice, seeing her son's expression close even more. My pension barely pays the household bills, and what I save is for… But he interrupted her with an abrupt gesture of his hand, rising from the sofa with a sudden movement that made Patricia shrink in her place. "Don't come to me with excuses," Roberto practically shouted, his face red with anger. "I know you have money saved. You always did. You always denied me everything." Helena felt tears burning her eyes, but breathed deeply before responding. "Son, I have never denied you anything that was within my reach." Helena spoke with a firm voice despite the trembling, also standing up to face him. "I raised you alone after your father died. I worked sewing until my fingers bled so you wouldn't go without." The words came out loaded with accumulated hurt, memories of years sacrificing every penny to ensure that Roberto had education, decent clothes, food on the table. She remembered the late nights sewing party dresses, the weekends making cakes to sell, the extra cleaning jobs she did in family homes to pay for his private school. "I worked very hard, Roberto, very hard indeed, and today I live on my pension," she continued, her voice breaking. "I cannot give you what I don't have available." Roberto's face contorted into an expression of contempt that cut through Helena's heart like a sharp blade. Patricia remained silent on the sofa, looking at her own hands, clearly uncomfortable but lacking the courage to intervene. "Are you telling me that after everything I did for you, you won't help me now?" he questioned with a dangerously low voice. "It's not that I don't want to, son. It's that I literally don't have $15,000, Helena repeated, taking a step toward Roberto with her hands extended in supplication. "I can help you with what I have saved, the $3,000. I know it's not what you need, but…" The explosion that followed was like a hurricane destroying everything in its path. Roberto advanced on her with a finger pointed, his face inches from hers, his eyes injected with a rage that seemed to come from a place much deeper than the present situation. $3,000? He spat the words with scorn. "You think $3 miserable thousand solve anything?" Helena instinctively backed away, her body recognizing danger, even if her mind refused to accept that her son could hurt her. "You've always been like this. Always stingy, always selfish, keeping money for yourself while I make do however I can," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "I live in that tiny house while you stay here in your comfortable little home." The accusations were so unfair that Helena felt her breath fail, but before she could defend herself, Roberto took the step that would change everything forever. "Get out of my way, you useless old woman," Roberto growled, and with a sudden movement of his arm pushed Helena hard. But the push was not enough to satiate his anger, and when she staggered trying to maintain balance, he raised his leg and delivered a kick to her chest. The impact made Helena fall backward, her knees hitting hard on the ceramic floor of the living room, her hands trying to cushion the fall. Pain exploded in her body, but it was a minor pain compared to the agony tearing through her heart seeing her son standing before her, his face contorted in fury, while she was there on the floor, humiliated, hurt, broken. "Roberto!" Patricia finally shouted, rising from the sofa with eyes wide with horror. "For God's sake, what have you done?" But Roberto seemed not to hear her, looking at his fallen mother as if she were something repugnant, despicable. Helena remained on her knees, tears finally flowing freely down her face, her breathing coming in painful sobs as she processed the unthinkable that had just happened. The son she had carried in her womb, breastfed, raised alone, had just kicked her as if she were trash in the street. The silence that followed was broken only by Helena's sobs and Roberto's heavy breathing, who remained standing before her like a furious giant. Patricia ran to Helena, kneeling beside her and trying to help her up, but the old lady seemed to have lost all strength. "Donna Helena, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Patricia murmured through tears, casting glances of horror and disapproval at her husband. Roberto finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had done, but instead of remorse, his face showed only more anger, as if it were his mother's fault for provoking him. "You forced me to do this," he said with a hard voice, but there was a slight tremor in it that betrayed his false confidence. "If you had given me the money, none of this would have happened." Helena finally found the strength to raise her head and look at her son, and what he saw in those eyes made him instinctively step back. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain, it wasn't even anger. It was something much worse. It was absolute disappointment. It was the moment when unconditional love finally found its limit. "Get out of my house," Helena said in a low but firm voice, each word heavy as lead. "What?" Roberto questioned, as if he hadn't heard correctly, his expression oscillating between disbelief and a new wave of anger. Helena stood up with Patricia's help, her legs trembling, but her determination growing with each second. She wiped the tears with the back of her hand, straightened up as much as the pain allowed, and faced her son with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I told you to leave my house," she repeated, louder this time, pointing to the door with a trembling but determined hand. "Now, Roberto." The young man looked at his mother as if she had gone mad, as if he had the right to be there after what he had just done. "You're kicking me out?" he asked with a disbelieving laugh. "From the house that I paid for half the renovations?" The statement was ridiculous, such a blatant lie that even Patricia looked at him with surprise. "You gave me $2,000 3 years ago to fix the roof," Helena retorted with a tired voice. "And I thank you for that, but this house is mine, bought with the sweat of my labor, and you are no longer welcome here." The shock on Roberto's face was replaced by pure hatred. "Well, stay here alone then, you ungrateful old woman!" Roberto spat the words like venom, turning toward the door with a sudden movement. "And don't come looking for me when you're sick, when you need help, when you have no one." Patricia hesitated for a moment, looking between her husband and Helena with a torn expression, but finally mumbled an almost inaudible apology and followed Roberto. Helena remained standing in the middle of the living room, listening to the door slam, the car start, the sound of the engine fading away. Only then did she allow her legs to give way, sitting heavily in the armchair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The house returned to silence, but it was a different silence now, laden with something definitive, irreversible. She looked at the table still set, the untouched cake, the cups waiting for coffee that would never be served. "My God," she whispered into the emptiness. "What happened?" But she knew exactly what had happened. The son she had raised, whom she had loved more than her own life, had just shown who he really was, and this revelation hurt more than any physical pain. Helena remained seated for long minutes, perhaps hours, lost in memories that now seemed to belong to another life. She remembered Roberto as a child, that bright-eyed boy who ran into her arms when he came, back from school, who helped her hang clothes on the clothesline, who said that when he grew up, he would buy a big house for her. Where had that boy been lost? When had love turned into greed, into resentment, into violence? She touched her chest where the kick had landed, feeling the throbbing pain that she knew would turn into a bruise. 65 years of life, 45 years of hard work, 15 years of lonely widowhood, and all to arrive here, fallen on the floor of her own house by the son she had raised. "No," she said aloud, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I won't let this destroy me." Slowly, very slowly, Helena rose from the armchair, each movement a small victory over the pain, over the humiliation, over the despair. She walked to the kitchen, prepared tea with still trembling hands, sat at the table, and looked at the cake she had made with such care. 38 years, she murmured thoughtfully. I gave 38 years of my life to raise this man, and he kicks me like a dog. A solitary tear ran down her face, but there was something different about her now. It wasn't just sadness, it was also determination. As she drank her tea, Helena felt something changing inside her, as if a door that had always been open finally closed, and another, which had always been locked, began to open. For decades she had lived for her son, every decision thinking of him, every penny saved, imagining that one day he would need it. But Roberto didn't need her. He had never really needed her. What he wanted was to control her, to suck from her everything he could, until nothing was left. Well, she said to herself, a small spark of something that could be called rebellion lighting up in her chest. He's going to be surprised when he finds out who I really am. Helena finished her tea, stood up with renewed determination, and walked to the living room. Her gaze fell on the large picture that had hung on the wall for 38 years. The black and white photo of her wedding, she and her husband smiling on a day that seemed to belong to another life. Carefully, she removed the heavy picture from the wall, turned it over, and there it was, attached with reinforced adhesive tape in the four corners. A black executive leather folder that Roberto had passed by thousands of times without ever knowing of its existence. Inside the folder, impeccably organized documents in protective plastic sleeves, bank statements from an account Roberto was unaware of, investment papers made over decades. $1,200,000. He thinks I'm a poor and useless old woman, Helena muttered, looking at the documents with an inscrutable expression. But he never knew anything about me, really. The revelation of this so carefully guarded secret filled Helena with a complex mixture of emotions. She remembered that terrible day 38 years ago, when she was only 2 months pregnant with Roberto and received the news that her parents had died in a car accident. Portuguese merchants who had worked 40 years in their prosperous grocery store in the neighborhood, they left to her, their only daughter, their entire inheritance, $850,000 between the sale of the business, 2 rented properties, and lifetime savings. A fortune that could have changed everything. But Helena, pregnant and grieving, made a conscious decision that day. She would raise her son without him knowing about the money. She had seen cousins destroyed by easy wealth, spoiled young people who never worked and became empty people. She would live modestly, work honestly, teach her son the value of sweat, humility, character. I'll tell him when he deserves it, she had promised herself at her parents' burial. When he shows he's a good person. She invested the money wisely over 38 years, and the amount grew to $1,200,000. But the years passed, and Roberto never deserved it. At 8, he lied about having stolen money from her. At 12, he charged classmates to borrow toys. At 16, he was ashamed of his mother's poorhouse. At 20, he wasted every penny she gave him. At 30, he began to see her as a burden, an obligation, someone who hindered his social ascent. For 38 years he passed by more than $1 million. Helena muttered, looking at the picture frame from behind. Hidden behind this photo, centimeters away from him, and never knew because he was never worthy of knowing. And now, after the violence, the humiliation, the kick that threw her to the floor, Helena knew with absolute certainty that Roberto would never see a penny of that money. When the sun finally rose, Helena got up from bed with careful movements, observing the bruises that were beginning to appear on her knees, the pain in her chest that worsened when breathing deeply. She dressed slowly, pausing after each piece of clothing to rest, and walked to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Routine was a comfort, a reminder that life continued despite everything. But as she stirred sugar into her coffee, her eyes fell on the phone on the wall, and a decision formed in her mind. She needed to talk to someone, needed advice, support, someone who would listen without judgment. Rosa, her best friend for 40 years, the woman who had been by her side in all difficult moments. With still trembling hands, Helena picked up the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. "Rosa," she said when her friend answered, her voice breaking on the first word. "I need you. Can you come here?" The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Rosa responded with urgency in her voice. "I'm coming now," she promised without asking questions. 20 minutes, Helena. Hang in there." And the call ended, leaving Helena holding the phone against her chest, feeling for the first time in many hours that perhaps she wasn't completely alone. Rosa arrived in 15 minutes, not 20, and the expression on her face when Helena opened the door said it all. "My God, what happened to you?" she asked, quickly entering and closing the door behind her, her hands already reaching for Helena in a careful embrace. Rosa had been retired for 3 years from her job as a nursing assistant at the municipal hospital, and since then had devoted her time to volunteer work at the church and taking care of her friend when necessary. Helena didn't respond immediately, just allowed herself to be guided to the sofa, to feel the comfort of her friend's presence, the relief of no longer being alone. "It was Roberto," she finally said, the words coming out with difficulty, laden with shame that she knew was unjustified, but felt nonetheless. Rosa froze for a moment, processing the information, before her expression transformed into mixed horror and anger. "He hurt you?" she asked in a dangerously low voice, and Helena just nodded, unable to elaborate verbally. Then, in broken words, pauses to control emotions, Helena told everything. The visit, the demand for money, the argument, the shove, the kick that threw her to the floor. Rosa listened to everything in silence, her expression growing darker with each revelation, her hands squeezing Helena's with increasing strength. When Helena finished, the silence that followed was heavy as lead. "That bastard," Rosa finally said, her voice trembling with contained anger. "That miserable, ungrateful bastard." She got up from the couch and began to walk around the room, her hands trembling, clearly trying to control the impulse to do something drastic. "You need to call the police, Helena. This is assault. It's domestic violence." But Helena shook her head, a small but decisive movement. "I can't," she said in a tired voice. "Not for him, but for Tiago. How can I put a 12-year-old boy's father in jail? What would that do to my grandson? The justification wasn't about protecting Roberto, but about protecting the innocent child who didn't deserve to see his father imprisoned." Her friend turned to her with an expression of disbelief. "Helena, he kicked you, threw you to the ground as if you were nothing," Rosa argued, sitting back down beside her friend. "You can't let this slide. You can't simply accept this." But Helena had other ideas, plans that had begun to take shape in her mind during the long, sleepless night. "I won't accept it," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "But I won't go to the police either. I have something else in mind." Rosa looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" she asked, and Helena took a deep breath before answering. "Can I tell you a secret, Rosa?" Helena asked, looking at her friend with a serious expression. "A secret I've kept for a very, very long time?" Rosa nodded without hesitation, and Helena slowly rose from the couch, gesturing for her friend to follow her to the living room. There, she carefully removed the large wedding portrait from the wall, turned it around, and showed the black leather folder attached with adhesive tape. "What's that?" Rosa asked, approaching with curiosity. Helena removed the tape carefully, opened the executive folder, and took out the impeccably organized documents, spreading them on the coffee table with careful hands. "This," she said with a small, sad smile, "is $1,200,000 that I've saved since before Roberto was born." Rosa's jaw literally dropped, her eyes scanning the documents with an expression of absolute shock. 1 million? Helena, are you telling me you have $1,200,000 saved? She asked, her voice rising an octave in disbelief. Helena nodded, sitting on the couch next to the scattered documents. "Inheritance from my parents when they died?" she confirmed, her voice breaking. "I was 2 months pregnant. $850,000 that I carefully invested for 38 years. Rosa had to sit down, her legs seeming unable to support her anymore. "And Roberto knows nothing about this?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "He thinks I'm a poor thing living on a miserable pension," Helena replied, a bitter note in her voice. "I always thought that one day I would tell him when he matured, when he showed he was responsible." She looked at the documents spread on the bed, decades of sacrifice represented in papers and numbers. "I saved all of this thinking of him, Rosa. Every cent was to secure his future, so that he would never want for anything." Tears threatened to return, but Helena contained them with effort. "But yesterday he showed who he really is, and now I know he will never, ever see a penny of this." Rosa took her friend's hand, squeezing it tightly. "What are you going to do then?" she asked softly. Helena remained silent for a long moment, looking out the bedroom window, watching the trees sway with the wind outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, decided, carrying a determination that came from a very deep place. "I'm going to change my will," she said simply. "I'm going to see a lawyer today. I'm going to ensure that when I die, this money goes to those who really need it, to causes that make a difference in the world." Rosa smiled through her own tears, squeezing Helena's hand in silent approval. The two women spent the rest of the morning talking, planning, and slowly the pain in Helena's chest began to diminish. Not the physical one, but the emotional. Having someone by her side, someone who supported her, who validated her feelings and her decision, made all the difference. Rosa insisted on taking her to the doctor to check her injuries, but Helena refused, saying nothing was broken, that the bruises would heal on their own. "I'm staying with you today," Rosa announced in a tone that accepted no discussion. "I won't leave you alone after what happened." Helena wanted to protest, to say she was fine, that she didn't need a babysitter, but the words died in her throat. The truth was, she didn't want to be alone. Not today. Not yet. "Thank you," she said simply, and Rosa nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They prepared lunch together, ate in comfortable silence, and then Rosa helped Helena look for lawyers specializing in wills. When they found one with a good reputation that worked on Saturdays, Rosa scheduled an appointment for the next weekend. "1 week," Helena murmured, looking at the lawyer's card. "In 1 week, I'll start changing everything." That afternoon passed in a strange kind of haze, where Helena oscillated between the pain of betrayal and the determination to move forward. Rosa noticed the moments when her friend became too quiet, lost in thoughts, and gently brought her back, talking about trivialities, recalling funny stories, making tea. When night began to fall, Rosa finally prepared to leave, but not before making Helena promise that she would call if she needed anything. "Any time, Helena? Promise?" she insisted, and Helena promised with a tight hug that made both of them hold back tears. After Rosa left, the house returned to silence, but it was a different silence now. Helena no longer felt so alone, no longer felt so lost. She had a plan, had support, had determination. She sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and began to write, listing institutions she knew, causes she had always wanted to support, ways to make her money really matter. "Women victims of domestic violence," she wrote at the top of the list, underlining it twice. "Ironic," she thought with a bitter smile. "I've become exactly that, a victim in my own home." But she would not just be a victim, she would also be a survivor, and more than that, she would be someone who used her pain to help others. The phone rang, breaking the silence, and Helena looked at it with her heart racing. Would it be Roberto calling to apologize? Would it be Patricia trying to mediate? But when she answered, she immediately recognized the young, familiar voice. "Grandma?" said the voice on the other end, and Helena felt her heart tighten. It was Tiago, Roberto's son, her only 12-year-old grandson. "Hi, my love," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "How are you?" There was a pause on the other end, and when the boy spoke again, his voice was laden with childish concern, that mixture of fear and confusion. "Grandma, what happened yesterday? Dad came home very angry, and Mom was crying, and I was scared." Helena closed her eyes, feeling a new layer of pain. Of course Tiago would find out. Of course the situation would affect the child. "We had a disagreement, dear," she said carefully, not wanting to turn the boy against his father. "But nothing you need to worry about." There was silence, and then the small, hesitant voice. "Will you be okay, Grandma?" The genuine but still innocent concern of a 12-year-old child. Helena felt her heart tighten. How to answer that? How to protect the child's innocence without lying? "Your father was very upset, Tiago," Helena began, choosing each word carefully. "And adults sometimes do things they shouldn't when they're like that." She took a deep breath before continuing. "But this isn't your fault, and you don't need to worry about it, okay?" Tiago was silent for a moment before responding. "Can I visit you, Grandma? I can take the bus by myself." The offer touched Helena's heart in a way she hadn't expected. "Of course you can, my love," she replied, her voice choking. "But talk to your mother first, okay?" They talked for a few more minutes about school, about friends, about trivialities that brought a little normality back. When they finally said goodbye, Helena hung up the phone and let the tears fall freely. Tiago was innocent in all of this, a child caught in the middle of an adult conflict he hadn't created nor deserved to witness. "He won't suffer the consequences of this," Helena said aloud to the empty house. "I won't let Roberto destroy that boy too." And another decision formed in her mind, another change in the plans that were beginning to take shape. Part of the money would go to Tiago, but only when he turned 25, only when he was mature enough to use it wisely, only when he was far from his father's influence. Helena spent the rest of the evening refining her plans, writing and rewriting her list, calculating values, imagining the impact her money could have in the right hands. When she finally went to bed, it was past midnight, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She still felt the physical pain of the injuries, still felt the emotional weight of betrayal, but there was also something new, something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that could be called purpose. Roberto had given her the greatest gift without knowing it, showing his true face before it was too late, before she made the mistake of leaving everything to someone who didn't deserve it, who wouldn't value it, who would probably waste it within a matter of years. "Thank you, son," she whispered in the dark, without irony or sarcasm, just acknowledgement of a painful truth. "Thank you for showing me who you really are." And with that thought, Helena finally fell asleep, her last image before sleep being not of the adult Roberto who had kicked her, but of child Tiago, innocent and pure, representing hope amid the darkness. The week following the incident passed in a strange kind of limbo for Helena, where the days blended into one another in a routine that was familiar, yet fundamentally different. She woke up early as always, prepared coffee, tended to the garden, sewed for the neighbors, but now each movement carried a new weight, an acute awareness that her life had changed irreversibly on that fateful Sunday. The bruises on her knees went through all shades of purple and yellow. The pain in her chest diminished but never completely disappeared, and whenever she looked in the mirror, she saw the physical signs of what had happened. Rosa visited every day, sometimes staying just half an hour for coffee, other times spending the entire afternoon, and Helena silently thanked her for her friend's constant presence, for the way she filled the void that Roberto had left by destroying the last remnant of relationship between them. "How are you feeling today?" Rosa would ask every morning, and Helena always answered better. And it wasn't completely a lie. She was better, not physically perhaps, but emotionally, psychologically. She was beginning to process, to accept, to plan. Saturday finally came, bringing with it the appointment with the lawyer, and Helena woke up that day with butterflies in her stomach, nervous but determined. Rosa came to pick her up at 9 a.m, driving her old sedan carefully through the neighborhood streets to the lawyer's office in the city center. Helena observed through the window, watching shops and people pass by, thinking about how the world continued turning, indifferent to the personal revolutions of each individual. The office was in a modest but well-maintained building, and when they went up to the 3rd floor, they were greeted by a friendly secretary who had them sit in a comfortable waiting room. "Dr. Marcos will see you in a few minutes," she informed them with a smile, and Helena nodded gratefully, her hands intertwined in her lap to hide the trembling. Rosa noticed her friend's nervousness and covered her hands with her own, squeezing gently. "Everything will be fine," she murmured, and Helena wanted to believe that with every fiber of her being. When the office door finally opened, a middle-aged man with glasses and a kind expression appeared, extending his hand to them. "Mrs. Helena, Mrs. Rosa, pleased to meet you. I'm Dr. Marcos." He introduced himself, and his voice had a comforting quality that immediately put Helena more at ease. They entered the office, sat in the comfortable chairs facing the large desk, and Dr. Marcos took a notepad and a pen before looking at Helena with professional but warm attention. "So," he began in a soft voice, "from our phone conversation, I understood that you wish to make a will, is that correct?" Helena nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes," she confirmed, and then, encouraged by Rosa's supportive look, began to tell her story. Not all the details, not the explicit violence, but enough for Dr. Marcos to understand the context, the urgency, the need to ensure that her wishes would be respected after her death. She spoke about the money she had quietly accumulated over decades, about the son she had always thought to benefit, about the recent change in perspective. Dr. Marcos listened attentively, making occasional notes, his face maintaining a professional expression that didn't judge, but clearly understood. "I understand," he said when Helena finished. "And are you absolutely certain of this decision? Disinheriting your son, especially under circumstances like these, may generate legal challenges after your passing." Helena didn't hesitate for even a second. "I am certain," she affirmed in a firm voice. "Roberto showed that he doesn't deserve this money, and I want it to go to those who truly need it." Dr. Marcos nodded, respecting the determination in her voice, and began to explain the process, the options, the ways to make the will incontestable. They spent the next 2 hours immersed in legal details, with Dr. Marcos patiently explaining every aspect of the will they were constructing. Helena decided to divide her assets as follows: $400,000 for a trust fund that would be given to Tiago when he turned 25, with the condition that the money be used for education, housing, or investment in his own business, never simply withdrawable in cash that Roberto could manipulate. $300,000 to an organization that helped women victims of domestic violence, a choice that Dr. Marcos discreetly praised as very noble. $200,000 to the neighborhood church, with the condition that they be used for social programs, not for buildings or luxuries. $100,000 to a local orphanage that Helena had visited a few times as a volunteer years ago. $50,000 for Rosa, not out of obligation, but out of love and gratitude for 40 years of unwavering friendship. And the remaining $150,000 would be used to cover funeral expenses, legal fees, and whatever was left would be distributed among small local charities. "And Roberto?" Dr. Marcos asked, looking over his glasses at Helena. "Formally, will he receive nothing?" Helena took a deep breath, thinking about the question, its weight, the finality of this decision. "He will receive something," Helena said after a long silence, an idea taking shape in her mind. "I want to leave a letter for him, explaining why, so he knows it was his choice, a consequence of his actions." Dr. Marcos nodded, approving the idea, suggesting that the letter be sealed and delivered along with the official documents after Helena's death. "And this letter can be written in your own time, kept with the will documents," he explained. "It's something personal, not legal, but important for closure." Helena agreed, already mentally formulating what she would write, the words she would use to finally tell her son everything she always wanted but never managed to. When all the details were decided, Dr. Marcos began drafting the official document, reading each section aloud to ensure that Helena understood and agreed with everything. The process was long, meticulous, exhaustive, but when they finally reached the end, when Helena signed the document with witnesses present as required by law, she felt an enormous weight being lifted from her shoulders. "Done," Dr. Marcos said with a smile, storing the documents in a special folder. "Your will is officialized, registered, and will be kept safely here in the office until it is necessary." He looked at Helena with a gentle expression. "You made a difficult but firm decision, and I can guarantee that your wishes will be respected." In the days following the formalization of the will, Helena verified all her accounts and investments, making sure that Dr. Marcos had all the necessary banking information to execute the will when the time came. The money remained where it had always been, distributed among investment accounts and high-yield savings, accessible with passwords that only she knew. The leather folder behind the painting continued to keep the main documents, statements, and certificates, tangible evidence of decades of secrecy and financial discipline. The painting on the wall remained as the silent guardian of the truth that Roberto would never discover in life. Helena and Rosa left the office 3 hours after they had arrived, both exhausted but with a sense of mission accomplished. On the way back home, they stopped at a small restaurant for lunch, and it was only there, sitting at the table with a plate of homemade food in front of her, that Helena allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. "How are you feeling?" Rosa asked, and this time Helena knew exactly how to respond. "Free," she said simply, surprising even herself with the choice of word. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control of my own life." Rosa smiled, raising her glass of juice in a silent toast, and Helena reciprocated, the two glasses meeting with a small clink that sealed that moment. "And now?" Rosa asked after a few minutes of eating in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Helena thought about the question, chewing slowly, organizing thoughts that were still confused, but beginning to take shape. "Now I live," she finally answered. "I live the way I always wanted, but never could because I was always worried about Roberto, always saving every penny thinking of him." She put her fork on the plate and looked out the restaurant window. "I'm 65, Rosa. Who knows how much time I still have? And I spent all these years depriving myself of everything, living like a poor person when I didn't need to, saving for a future that may never come." Rosa listened attentively, understanding where her friend was going. "Are you going to start using the money?" Rosa asked with some concern. "Not doing anything crazy, I hope." Helena laughed, the sound surprising both of them for being genuine, light, something that hadn't happened in days. "No, I'm not going to start spending wildly," she assured. "But I'm also not going to live as if I were in misery anymore when I have resources." She began to enumerate on her fingers, her eyes shining with newly discovered possibilities. "I want to travel, Rosa. I've never traveled in my life. Never seen the sea, never seen the mountains, never left this city." The admission brought a knot to her throat, the painful awareness of everything she had denied herself. "I want to eat at real restaurants, not just on special occasions, but because I want to." She continued, gaining momentum, enthusiasm growing with each word. "I want to buy new clothes, not keep mending the same pieces until they're unrecognizable." Rosa listened with tears in her eyes, happy to see her friend finally allowing herself to live. "And I want to help people, Rosa, while I'm still alive to see the difference it makes," Helena concluded, her voice firm and determined. "I don't want to wait until I die for my money to do good. I want to start now." And in that moment, sitting in that simple restaurant with her best friend, Helena Santos began to free herself from the chains she herself had built over decades. When she arrived home, Helena felt energized. She walked through the garden, noticing flowers that needed pruning, but feeling gratitude for having that space. "I could hire someone to help," she thought, the idea revolutionary. She entered the house and opened the closet, seeing clothes from 15-20 years ago. "I can buy new clothes," she said aloud, and it sounded like freedom. Even thinking about these changes, she knew she would never be extravagant. But there was a difference between being careful and unnecessarily depriving herself, and it was this line that she had finally learned to distinguish. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts, and when Helena answered, she was surprised to hear Patricia's hesitant voice on the other end. "Donna Helena?" her daughter-in-law said in a timid voice. I wanted to know how you are." The gesture touched Helena unexpectedly, a reminder that Patricia, despite all her flaws and weaknesses, still had some humanity, still cared on some level. "I'm getting better, Patricia," Helena answered honestly, without rancor in her voice. "The bruises are healing." There was a long pause on the other end, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice was laden with guilt. Donna Helena, I'm sorry for what happened. I should have done something, should have stopped him. But Helena gently interrupted her, not wanting to hear excuses that wouldn't change anything. Patricia, it's not your fault what Roberto did, she said firmly. He is an adult man responsible for his own actions. More silence, and then Patricia asked the question Helena knew would eventually come. Are you going to tell anyone? Go to the police? Helena considered the question, thinking about all the ramifications, all the consequences. No, she finally answered. I won't go to the police, but I'm also not going to pretend it didn't happen. She took a deep breath before continuing. Roberto is no longer welcome in my house, Patricia. Is that clear to you? Patricia sobbed on the other end of the line, a muffled sound betraying tears she was trying to control. I understand, she said in a broken voice. And I don't blame you. I really don't. There was another pause, and then Patricia said something that surprised Helena. He's not well, Donna Helena. Since that day he's been different, more withdrawn, more nervous. Helena felt a pang of what might be maternal concern, but she suppressed it quickly, refusing to let old habits resurface. That's something he needs to resolve on his own, Patricia, she replied, keeping her voice firm. And maybe it's good for him to face the consequences of his actions. But then she thought of Tiago, the innocent boy caught in the middle of all this. How is Tiago? She asked, unable to contain her concern for her grandson. He's fine, Patricia assured her. Asks about you every day, wants to come visit you. Helena's heart tightened, torn between the desire to see her grandson and the fear of causing more problems. Let me think about it, Patricia, she finally said. Maybe in a few weeks, when things calm down a bit. They said goodbye shortly after, and Helena hung up the phone with mixed feelings, gratitude that Patricia had called mixed with sadness for the whole situation. Night fell, and Helena found herself again at the kitchen table, but this time with paper and pen, preparing to write the letter she would leave for Roberto. The words would not come easily, she knew, but they needed to be said, needed to be recorded, so that when she was no longer here, he would know, he would understand. She began to write, then stopped, crumpled the paper, and started again. The process repeated several times until finally she found the right words, the right tone, the message she needed to convey. My son, she wrote, and in just the first 2 words, she felt the weight of everything that would follow. When you read this, I will have already departed, and you will be discovering that I left nothing for you in my will. I know you will be furious, perhaps curse me, perhaps say I was always selfish and bad. But I need you to know the truth. Helena paused, wiping away a tear that had fallen on the paper, slightly smudging the ink. She continued writing, each word coming out with difficulty, but with necessity. Since before you were born, since I inherited money from my parents when I was pregnant, I invested and saved everything thinking about your future. For 38 years, every financial decision I made was thinking of you, your security, the day I would tell you. I accumulated $1,200,000, Roberto, $1,200,000 that you didn't even know existed. Helena continued the letter, describing in detail how she had obtained the money, each source of income, each sacrifice, each decision to deny herself something to be able to save more. I lived like a poor woman when I didn't need to, Roberto, all thinking of you, all saving for the day I would tell you and you would be happy, proud, grateful. The tears were falling freely now, but she didn't wipe them away, letting them stain the paper. Part of her truth poured out in liquid form. But then came that Sunday, and you showed me who you really are. You kicked me, Roberto, threw me to the floor of my own home because I didn't have $15,000 to give you immediately. The pen trembled in her hand, the memory still fresh, still painful. In that moment, I realized you never deserved this money, would never appreciate the sacrifice it represented, would never use it for anything good. Helena then explained where the money would go, each destination carefully chosen, each amount with purpose. Your son Tiago will receive $400,000 when he turns 25, not because you deserve it, but because he is innocent and deserves a chance. She described the other donations, the organizations, the causes, ending with words she knew would hurt him, but needed to be said. You could have had everything, Roberto, literally everything, but you chose violence, chose disrespect, chose to treat me as less than nothing. These choices have consequences, and this is yours. Helena signed the letter with a trembling hand, carefully folded it, and placed it in an envelope that she sealed with wax, a final touch of formality. She wrote for Roberto on the front and kept the envelope together with the copy of the will that Dr. Marcos had given her, everything in a special folder that would stay with her important documents. Done, she murmured, feeling as if she had run a marathon, exhausted but satisfied for having finished. The night was advanced when she finally went to bed, but before sleeping, Helena did something she hadn't done in a long time. She prayed. She didn't ask for Roberto, didn't ask for reconciliation. She asked for strength to continue, for wisdom to use well the time she had left, for peace to accept the things she couldn't change. And thank you, she added at the end of the prayer. Thank you for giving me courage to finally live my own life. And with that gratitude in her heart, she fell asleep more deeply than she had slept in all that terrible week. The following days brought a new routine for Helena, one that included small pleasures she had previously denied herself. She started by buying new clothes, nothing extravagant, but comfortable and beautiful pieces that made her feel good. She visited a beauty salon for the first time in years, cut and dyed her hair, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman she didn't immediately recognize. Younger, more vibrant, more alive. Rosa laughed with joy when she saw her, commenting that Helena seemed to have rejuvenated 10 years, and Helena believed it because she felt that way, renewed from the inside out. She began frequenting the corner bakery every morning to have coffee and eat fresh bread, a simple but significant luxury for someone who had always bought the cheapest bread at the market. She chatted with other regular customers, made friends, laughed at silly jokes, lived. This is what I've been missing all these years, she realized one morning, sitting at the bakery table with hot coffee between her hands. Connection, community, life beyond the four walls of my house. The revelation was both liberating and sad, awareness of all she had lost, but also of all the possibilities still ahead of her. It was on one of these mornings at the bakery, 2 weeks after the incident with Roberto, that Helena met Carmen, a woman of similar age who lived in the neighborhood but whom she had never noticed before. They started talking casually about the weather, then about the bread, then about life in general, and discovered they had much in common. Carmen was also a widow, also had a problematic son, also had spent years sacrificing for a family that didn't appreciate her. The friendship between Helena and Carmen blossomed quickly, becoming so significant that 3 weeks after meeting, Helena scheduled a second appointment with Dr. Marcos to add a codicil to the will. I want to include a new beneficiary, she explained. $50,000 for Carmen Silva, my friend. Dr. Marcos prepared the additional document, adjusting the portion intended for charities from $150,000 to $100,000, and formalized the change with the same meticulousness as the original will. This codicil has the same legal validity, he assured, and Helena signed satisfied, knowing she was acknowledging someone who had genuinely helped her be reborn. I worked 30 years as an elementary school teacher, Carmen recounted, stirring her coffee distractedly. I retired at 60 with a modest pension, but my husband had left a good life insurance when he died. I put it all together and decided to live. She smiled with a touch of rebellion. But one day I woke up and realized I was wasting the years I had left, saving money for a son who only saw me as a bank. I decided I was going to live for myself, do things I always wanted, but never had the courage to. She looked at Helena with a conspiratorial smile. I started traveling, visited beautiful places, made friends in every city. Helena's eyes shone with genuine interest. And your son? How did he react? Carmen shrugged, a gesture indicating that his opinion didn't matter as much as Helena expected. He was angry at first, thought I was wasting his inheritance, she admitted with a bitter laugh. But eventually he understood that the money was mine, the life was mine, and I was going to do whatever I pleased. The story resonated deeply with Helena, validating feelings and decisions that still occasionally left her insecure. The two women quickly became friends, that kind of friendship that flourishes between people who have gone through similar experiences and understand each other without needing long explanations. Carmen told stories about her travels, showed photos, described places that Helena only knew from television programs, and with each story, Helena felt the desire to experience that growing stronger. You should come with me on my next trip, Carmen suggested one day, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I'm planning to go to the beach next month. A simple hotel, but right by the sea. Helena felt her heart race with possibility, mixed with fear. I've never traveled, Carmen, she admitted, the shame obvious in her voice. I don't even know what it's like to fly. Carmen took her hand across the table, squeezing with encouraging firmness. Nobody is born knowing, Helena, she said gently, and there's no age limit to start living. The conversation planted a seed that began to germinate in Helena's mind, growing stronger each day. Why not? She wondered, while tending to the garden, while sewing, while preparing meals. Why not do this while I still can? And the more she thought about it, the fewer reasons she found not to accept the invitation, and the more reasons she discovered to embrace the opportunity. It was with this mixture of excitement and nervousness that Helena called Carmen a week later and accepted the invitation for the beach trip. The two began planning together, deciding dates, booking a hotel, buying bus tickets since Helena still didn't feel ready to fly. Let's take it slow, Carmen said understandingly. First the beach by bus, then maybe a short flight, and eventually the whole world is open. The idea was both terrifying and exciting, and Helena found herself counting the days until the trip with anticipation she hadn't felt since childhood waiting for Christmas. She told Rosa about the plans, perhaps expecting disapproval, concerned that she was being impulsive, but Rosa merely smiled with that smile that said, finally. It's about time, Helena, she said with approval. About time you start really living. They went together to buy a swimsuit for Helena, something she had never owned in her life, and they laughed so much in the store that the saleswomen began laughing along without knowing why. 65 years old and buying my first bikini, Helena said between laughs. Who would have thought I'd get here? But there was joy in this realization. Not sadness for lost time, but happiness for the opportunity finally embraced. The night before the trip, Helena could barely sleep. a mixture of nervousness and excitement keeping her awake. She checked her suitcase several times, making sure she hadn't forgotten anything, although Carmen had assured that they could buy anything that was missing. "This is real," she whispered to herself in the dark. "I'm really doing this." And that night, lying in the bed of the house she had called home for so many decades, Helena realized something fundamental. Since the incident with Roberto, since that terrible moment that could have destroyed her, she had actually become stronger, freer, more genuinely alive than she had been in years. "Thank you," she murmured to the universe, to God, to whoever was listening. And this time, it wasn't gratitude just for courage, but also, in a strange and complicated way, gratitude for that fateful Sunday that had forced changes she would never have made alone. Sometimes, she thought as she finally fell asleep, we need to be broken to discover how to rebuild ourselves better. And with that thought, Helena Santos plunged into dreams full of waves and sand, of possibilities and new beginnings. The trip to the beach was transformative. The first sight of the sea brought tears to Helena's eyes, that blue immensity overwhelming any words. It was worth waiting 65 years for this, she told Carmen. They spent 5 days walking on the sand, swimming, talking about life honestly and openly. Helena told her about Roberto, about the hidden money, about her decisions. "You did the right thing," Carmen assured her as they watched the sunset. "You're finally living for yourself." When they returned, Helena was no longer the same woman who had left. When Helena arrived home after the beach trip, the first thing she did was check the painting on the wall, that silent guardian of her greatest secret. She carefully removed it, turned it over, made sure the leather folder was still there, intact, the tape showing no signs of having been touched. 38 years hanging here, she murmured, touching the frame affectionately. And he never knew, never even really looked. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her son, obsessed with money, passing by more than $1 million daily without even suspecting. She put the painting back on the wall, adjusting until it was perfectly aligned as it had always been, and smiled sadly at her wedding photo, at that 27-year-old young woman who had no idea what was to come. "I tried," she said to the photo, to the dead husband who looked back at her frozen in time. "God knows I tried to raise a good man." Roberto, on the other hand, was sinking into anger, guilt, and denial. Since that Sunday, he hadn't slept properly, waking up with the image of his mother fallen on the floor. Patricia barely spoke to him, moving through the house like a ghost. Tiago avoided his father whenever possible. The business worsened even more, his inability to focus resulting in lost clients. Instead of accepting responsibility, Roberto just sank deeper into resentment, blaming his mother for everything. 3 weeks after the incident, Roberto decided to go to his mother's house again. Patricia tried to dissuade him, but he was beyond reasoning, driven by a desperate need for money. He drove there on a Thursday, mentally practicing what he would say. When he saw Helena in the garden, she looked different. New haircut, colorful clothes, more vibrant. This ignited not joy, but anger in Roberto. Of course she's doing well, he thought bitterly. She has money stashed away while I'm drowning in debt. The perceived injustice fueled his anger. Helena heard the footsteps and looked up from the flowers she was pruning, her body automatically tensing upon recognizing her son. But there was no fear in her expression, just a calm firmness that was new, different. "Roberto?" she said simply, her voice neutral, without warmth but also without apparent hostility. merely stating a fact. Roberto stopped a few meters away, suddenly unsure of how to proceed, all manufactured confidence evaporating before that serene and firm gaze. "Mother?" he began, the word coming out with difficulty. "I need to talk to you." Helena placed the pruning shears on the ground carefully, wiped her hands on the apron she was wearing, and straightened up to face him completely. "I thought I made it clear that you were no longer welcome here," she said in a calm but definitive voice, each word clear and without hesitation. Roberto felt anger beginning to boil again, that feeling of being unfairly treated, of being the victim in that situation. "You're my mother," he spat the words. "You can't just banish me from your life." Helena gave a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I can and I am doing exactly that," she replied. "You lost the right to be here when you decided to kick me as if I were trash in the street." The direct mention of the incident made Roberto recoil as if he had been slapped. That moment he was trying so desperately to justify or forget being thrown in his face without preamble. "I was nervous, Mom," he tried to explain, his voice rising in pitch. "You know how much stress I was under, how much pressure, and you simply refused to help me." But Helena showed no signs of yielding, her expression remaining firm. "Being nervous doesn't justify violence, Roberto," she said calmly. "And I didn't refuse to help you. I literally didn't have the $15,000 you demanded." The words were true. Technically, she didn't have that money immediately available in her simple checking account. The investments were separate, secret, and she wouldn't lie about their existence, but wouldn't reveal them either. "But you've always had money saved," Roberto insisted, taking a step forward. "I know you do. I've always suspected you were hiding money from me." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with years of suspicion and resentment. Helena could deny it, could deflect, but instead, she opted for a partial truth. "And if I did have money saved," she said slowly, each word weighted, "it would be my right, my money earned through my work, mine to do with as I please." Roberto felt the world spinning, that answer being almost a confirmation, an implicit acknowledgement that only fueled his fury. "So you admit you have money hidden while your son is drowning in debt?" he shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "What kind of mother does that?" Helena didn't flinch, didn't back down, holding her ground with a strength that came from a place much deeper than physical force. "The kind of mother who worked 45 years to accumulate that money thinking about her son's future," she responded, her voice still calm but laden with an emotion that finally began to seep through. "The kind of mother who sacrificed day after day, lived like she was poor when she didn't need to, saved every penny thinking of you." She took a step toward Roberto, her eyes fixed on his. "And the kind of mother who finally realized that her son doesn't deserve a single cent of that sacrifice, not after so clearly showing what kind of man he's become." The words were like stabs, each one finding its target with painful precision. Roberto was speechless for a moment, processing not just what she said, but how she said it. The absolute clarity, the lack of doubt or guilt. "You're saying you have money but refuse to help me?" he finally managed to articulate, incredulous. "I'm saying I made choices about what to do with my money," Helena corrected firmly. "Choices that don't include rewarding violence and disrespect." She crossed her arms over her chest, a posture both defensive and authoritative. "You kicked me, Roberto, left marks on my body, humiliated me in my own home, and now you have the audacity to come here demanding money?" Each word came out laden with the pain that she finally allowed herself to express. What world is this where a son thinks he's entitled to his mother's money after hurting her? Roberto felt something breaking inside him. Not remorse yet, but a crack in his armor of justifications, a flash of awareness of how far he had fallen. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice suddenly small. "I just lost control." Helena looked at him with something that could be pity. "We all lose control sometimes, Roberto," she said softly. "But what we do in those moments defines who we really are." She turned and began walking back into the house, clearly ending the conversation. "And you showed me who you are, and I believed it." Roberto stood paralyzed in the garden, watching his mother enter the house, the door closing with a finality that was both literal and metaphorical. For a long moment, Roberto just stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, anger mixed with guilt, indignation mixed with shame. He wanted to scream, wanted to pound on the door, wanted to force his mother to listen to him, but something in that moment, perhaps emotional exhaustion, perhaps a belated flash of self-awareness, made him simply turn and walk back to the car. But before getting in, he looked at the house one more time, really looked, seeing not just the physical structure, but all the memories contained within those walls. Memories of a childhood that wasn't perfect, but was filled with love, of a mother who had worked until her fingers bled to ensure he had what he needed. "How did I get here?" he asked himself. The question so devastating because it had no easy answer, just a trail of bad choices that led to this moment. He got into the car and drove home on autopilot, his mind distant, still processing the conversation, the revelations, the implicit confirmation that his mother really had money, probably a lot of money, and had chosen not to share it with him. The injustice burned, but underneath it, buried but persistent, was something else, something that dangerously resembled shame. When Roberto arrived home, he found Patricia in the living room with Tiago, both watching television in silence that was broken only by his entrance. Patricia was wearing her uniform from the supermarket, where she had gotten a job as a cashier right after the incident, her modest salary being the only thing keeping the family afloat. "How did it go?" Patricia asked cautiously, and Roberto could see in her eyes that she was expecting the worst. "She has money," he said bluntly, throwing himself on the couch with a heavy movement. "She has a lot of money saved up and refuses to help me." Patricia and Tiago exchanged glances, a silent communication that Roberto noticed but couldn't interpret. "And you think she should give you money?" Patricia asked carefully. "After what you did?" The question, so simple yet so loaded, made Roberto explode. "She's my mother," he shouted, rising abruptly. "It's her obligation to help me, support me, be on my side." But Patricia didn't back down, and there was a new strength in her voice when she answered. "No, Roberto, it's not her obligation," she said firmly, surprising both her husband and herself. "You hurt her, you humiliated her, you lost the right to her help when you lost control that way." Tiago watched the exchange with wide eyes, clearly uncomfortable, but also absorbing every word. "You think it's right for her to let me sink?" Roberto questioned, his voice dangerously low. "I think she's protecting herself," Patricia responded. "And honestly, I don't blame her." Patricia's response was like a bucket of cold water, the realization that even his wife, the person who should be unconditionally on his side, questioned his actions. Roberto looked between Patricia and Tiago, seeing in their faces something that made his stomach turn. It wasn't just disapproval. It was disappointment. It was fear. It was a growing distance that he had caused, but didn't know how to fix. "You're all against me," he said, his voice broken, no longer from anger, but from something closer to despair. My own family turning their backs on me. But Patricia shook her head, rising from the couch and standing face to face with him. We're not against you, Roberto, she said in a softer voice. We're just tired of watching you destroy everything around you and refusing to take responsibility. She took Tiago's hand, the boy standing up and positioning himself next to his mother. You need help, Patricia continued. Professional help, therapy, something, because the way things are can't continue. Roberto wanted to argue, wanted to deny, but looking at his wife and son standing before him, united against him not in malice, but in self-preservation, something finally broke inside him. His legs gave way and he fell back onto the couch, his face falling into his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake with sobs he hadn't allowed for years. In the days that followed, financial reality knocked on the door without mercy. The $15,000 that Roberto desperately needed didn't magically appear, and the creditors wouldn't wait any longer. Patricia, seeing her husband finally breaking, took control of the situation with silent determination. She negotiated directly with the paper and ink suppliers, managing to split $7,000 into installments that bled them but were bearable. They sold Roberto's car for $6,500, keeping only hers, older, but functional. They borrowed $1,500 from Patricia's mother, promising to repay in installments. With these $15,000 gathered through hardship, they paid the most urgent debts with the equipment financier, avoiding judicial execution. She took over the accounting of the print shop, canceled the lease on the large space, and moved the operation to their home garage, discovering unnecessary expenses and waste that he made out of pure carelessness. We'll survive, she said one night as they reworked the budget at the kitchen table. But you'll have to really work, Roberto, not just complain and expect others to solve things. The print shop didn't go bankrupt, but it shrank drastically, becoming a backyard operation making flyers, business cards, and party invitations, something small and manageable without the industrial grandeur that Roberto had always dreamed of, but never had the competence to maintain. And it was Patricia who found a therapist who charged a social price at the community clinic, $15 per session subsidized by the city hall, an amount she could afford by tightening her already thin budget even more. Because even in therapy, Roberto needed someone to extend a hand to him. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was hoarse, broken. I am a monster, he said, the words muffled by his hands still covering his face. I was a monster to my mother, and I'm becoming a monster with you too. Patricia didn't deny it, didn't offer false comfort, but placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder. You did monstrous things, she said honestly. But you don't need to continue being this way. You can choose to change. Roberto finally raised his face, red and swollen eyes fixing on hers. How? He asked, the question genuine, desperate. How do I fix this? Patricia took a deep breath before answering. First, you need to really want to change, not because you want your mother's money or because you want me to stay, but because you want to be a better person. She looked at Tiago, then back at Roberto. And then you start slowly, one step at a time, beginning with taking responsibility for what you did. Roberto nodded, the movement small but significant, the first genuine acknowledgement of guilt he had shown since that fateful Sunday. While Roberto struggled with his internal demons, Helena continued her journey of self-discovery and liberation, exploring a world that had always existed, but that she had never allowed herself to inhabit. She and Carmen took more trips, each one a little more daring than the previous, first to the mountains, then to a historic city, and finally, Helena gathered courage for a short flight to the capital, an experience that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. I'm flying, she whispered to Carmen as the plane climbed above the clouds, tears streaming down her face. 65 years and I'm literally flying. She also began to use her money to help others, small donations here and there for causes that touched her heart. Women in domestic violence situations, children in need, abandoned elderly. Every time she saw the positive impact of her generosity, Helena felt a satisfaction that money kept in secret had never brought her. "This is what money should do," she told Rosa one afternoon, after visiting a shelter where her donation had helped buy new beds. "Help, improve lives, make a difference." Rosa agreed, proud of her friend, of the transformation she had witnessed, of the butterfly that had emerged from a cocoon of self-deprivation and misdirected sacrifice. It took 3 months from the incident for Roberto to finally write a letter to Helena, not at the suggestion of the therapist, who had already given up on getting him to have genuine insights, but by his own strategy. He calculated every word, every phrase, looking for the right tone between enough remorse to be credible and enough submission to perhaps, just perhaps, reopen some door. He wrote and rewrote, not seeking honesty, but effectiveness. "Mother," the letter began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to respond. Maybe you won't even read this, but I need to say that I recognize what I did." The words were calculated, rehearsed. "I spent 3 months in therapy trying to understand how I got to this point," he wrote, omitting that he had spent those 3 months obsessed with her money, not with the violence. "I realized that I was unfair, that I treated you badly, that I need to change." Each sentence was only superficially true, a performance of remorse, while inside he only thought about that $1,200,000 that had been so close, hidden behind a painting that he had passed by his whole life. He acknowledged her sacrifice, her hard work, her dedication, everything that he had previously seen as her obligation, but now understood as love that he hadn't deserved. "You gave me everything, and I repaid you with violence," the letter continued. "And I understand if you never want to see me again. I understand if you hate me. I understand if you've cut all contact with me." But then came the most important part. "I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't think I deserve it. I'm just saying that I'm sorry, deeply, painfully, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person, not to regain your approval, but because it's the right thing to do." Helena received the letter on a Tuesday morning, personally delivered by Patricia, who knocked timidly on the door and asked for just a few minutes of her time. "Ms. Helena," Patricia said, extending the envelope with trembling hands. "Roberto wrote this. He's not asking you to read it. He's not expecting an answer, but I thought I should deliver it personally." Helena took the envelope, feeling its weight, physically and metaphorically, and nodded in gratitude. "How is he?" she asked, unable to completely suppress the maternal concern even after everything, and Patricia gave a small, sad smile. "Struggling," she admitted, "but finally really struggling, trying to change, going to therapy." Helena felt something tighten in her chest, not exactly forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of the possibility of it. "And you and Tiago?" she asked, and Patricia sighed. "We're okay, better actually. Roberto is more present, more aware, still has a lot of work ahead, but at least he's trying." The two women remained silent for a moment before Patricia said goodbye, leaving Helena alone with the letter. She held it for a long time before finally finding the courage to open it, and when she read it, the tears came freely, not from sadness or anger, but from something more complex, a mixture of pain for what was, relief for some recognition, and weariness with the emotional weight of the situation. Helena received the letter and read it with an indecipherable expression. She showed it to Rosa, who sighed. "He's trying to get back to the money," Rosa said bluntly. "Every word in that letter is calculated." Helena nodded in agreement because she had seen it too. She knew her son, knew his patterns, his manipulations. It took 2 weeks before she picked up pen and paper. "Roberto," she wrote, the formality of the name intentional. "I read your letter. I don't believe in your sincerity, but I recognize the effort in trying to appear remorseful." She paused, organizing thoughts, deciding how much to reveal, how much to forgive. "What you did was unforgivable in the traditional sense. You hurt me in ways that go beyond the physical, broke something between us that will never be repaired." The words were coming firmly now. "I don't see that you're trying to really change, Roberto. I see that you're trying to regain access to the money you discovered I have. I know you better than you know yourself." Helena paused, deciding how much to reveal. "I won't see you again. That bridge was burned when you raised your leg and kicked me. I don't hate you, but I also no longer feel the unconditional love a mother should feel. You killed it that Sunday." She then made a decision, something she had been considering since reading his letter. "I will do something for Tiago, not for you, but for the innocent boy who deserves more than the mistakes of the adults around him." And with that decision, Helena added a codicil to her will, increasing Tiago's portion from $400,000 to $500,000, proportionally reducing the donations to the church from $200,000 to $150,000, and to the orphanage from $100,000 to $50,000, ensuring that her grandson would have financial security when he matured. That same afternoon, she took the letter she had written to Roberto months before and updated it, correcting the amount Tiago would receive from $400,000 to $500,000. Helena's letter arrived to Roberto like a bucket of cold water. He read it, hoping for some opening, some gap he could exploit, but found only closed and locked doors. "She saw through me," he told Patricia one night, the crumpled letter on the table. "Saw that I was trying to get back to the money." Patricia looked at him wearily. "Because that's exactly what you were doing, Roberto," she said without emotion, "and she knows you better than anyone." He reread the part about Tiago, the $500,000 his son would receive at 25, and felt not gratitude, but bitter envy. "My own son will have $500,000, and I won't see a penny," he muttered, and Patricia shook her head with disgust. "It's always about money with you," she said. "Always has been, always will be." And Roberto didn't deny it, because it was true, and they both knew it. Roberto nodded, but the spark of hope didn't last long. He continued therapy because Patricia demanded it, but there was never genuine transformation. He just learned to better control the mask, to hide the resentment that consumed him inside, to live with the bitterness of knowing he had been inches away from $1 million and lost everything by being exactly who he was. Months passed, turning into seasons, and life continued in its new configurations for everyone involved. Helena traveled more, helped more, lived more in the 6 months after the incident than in the previous 10 years. She still sewed, but for pleasure now, not out of necessity, creating beautiful pieces that she donated to charity. She still tended to the garden, but had hired a gardener to come once a week to help with the heavier work, allowing her to enjoy the beauty without the exhaustion. Rosa commented several times that Helena seemed to have rejuvenated, and it was true. There was a lightness to her now, a joy that came from living authentically, without the weight of secrets and misdirected self-sacrifice. Roberto continued attending therapy under Patricia's pressure, working 10 hours a day in what remained of his shrunken business, making deliveries personally, dealing with small clients, earning just enough to cover half of the bills while Patricia covered the other half with her cashier's salary. He controlled his visible anger better, but inside the resentment never died. He just learned to hide it. His relationship with Patricia became functional but cold, a survival partnership that she would eventually abandon. Tiago grew up observing his father, learning not because Roberto had genuinely changed, but because the boy clearly saw what he did not want to become. And although Roberto and Helena didn't see each other or speak, there was a silent truce, a tacit recognition that both were moving forward, neither together nor completely separate, but existing in their own orbits that occasionally touched through Tiago and Patricia. 1 year after that fateful Sunday, Helena woke up on her 66th birthday feeling something that could only be described as complete gratitude for being alive, for having survived not only the incident, but the entire life that had led to that point. Rosa and Carmen organized a small breakfast in her honor, inviting other friends that Helena had made in recent months, and when she looked around the table full of smiling faces, women who supported her, who celebrated her, who chose to be there, she felt a fullness she had never experienced before. "A toast," Rosa said, raising her glass of orange juice. "To Helena, the strongest woman we know, to the loyal friend, the brave traveler, the generous person who finally learned to be generous with herself too." Everyone toasted, glasses meeting with small, cheerful sounds, and Helena felt tears of happiness running down her face, not of sadness for what was, but of pure joy for what was now and could still be. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for being part of this new life I've built after almost being destroyed." And in that moment, surrounded by love and friendship, Helena Santos finally understood that sometimes the most painful endings are the most necessary beginnings, that being broken can be the first step to rebuilding stronger, and that it is never, ever too late to start truly living. Roberto, on that same day, not knowing it was his mother's birthday, was sitting in his therapist's office, fulfilling another mandatory session. "A year since the incident," the therapist observed. "What has changed?" Roberto thought about the question, comparing who he was a year ago with who he was now. Less explosive, certainly, but only because he had learned to control visible anger. Inside, resentment still boiled. "I've learned not to let things get to that point again," he said carefully, omitting that what he had really learned was to be more calculating, more controlled, more careful in hiding his true self. The therapist observed him with an expression suggesting he saw through the words, but merely nodded and took notes. They talked about next steps, about the eventual possibility of contact with Helena, but the therapist advised patience. "Let her come to you when she's ready," he suggested. "Continue improving, continue being the father and husband you want to be, and perhaps, with time, your mother will see these changes and choose to open the door again." Roberto nodded, accepting the wisdom of the advice, understanding that forcing forgiveness would just be another form of violence, more subtle, but equally wrong. When the session ended and he walked to the parking lot, Roberto looked at the clear sky, feeling for the first time in a long time something like peace, not complete, not without complications, but peace nonetheless. The peace that comes from knowing you are, finally, on the right path. The money that Helena had so carefully saved over decades continued to be used for good, planned donations that brought joy and made real difference in lives that would otherwise not receive help. She donated monthly to specific institutions, creating a simple but effective system to ensure her money helped those who really needed it. The will remained as established, Tiago as the main beneficiary, charities receiving significant portions, and Roberto receiving only the letter explaining why. Helena knew that when the day came, years or decades in the future, that decision would cause pain, especially for Roberto. But she made peace with it, understanding that some consequences are necessary, that maternal love does not mean accepting abuse or rewarding bad behaviors. "I love him," she said to Rosa one day while discussing the matter. "I'll always love that boy I raised, but I can't let that love destroy me or reward the violent man he's become." Rosa nodded in understanding and support, respecting the complexity of emotions and decisions that Helena was navigating. "You did the right thing," she assured, and Helena wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, because the alternative would be questioning the hardest decision she had ever made. As the months continued passing, turning into another year, Helena and Roberto existed in their parallel lives, aware of each other, but without direct contact, information passing through Patricia and occasionally Tiago, whom Helena had begun to see sometimes. Carefully planned meetings that didn't involve Roberto, but allowed her to maintain a relationship with her grandson. Tiago grew up knowing that his grandmother loved him, but also learning, through the whole situation, about consequences, about respect, about how our actions define who we are and how we are treated. "Grandma," he asked during one of these visits when he was 14, mature for his age, "will you ever forgive my father?" The question was direct and disarming, and Helena had to think carefully before answering. "I don't know, my love," she said honestly. "Forgiveness is complicated, especially when it involves violence and such a deep breach of trust." She took her grandson's hand, squeezing gently. "But I can tell you this. I'm trying, I'm working on it, and who knows what the future holds." The answer seemed to satisfy Tiago, who nodded with understanding beyond his years. "Dad is different now," he offered. "Better, calmer, more present." Helena felt that familiar mixture of relief and sadness. "I'm glad," she said sincerely. "I'm glad he's trying to be better, especially for you." Time, that great healer of wounds, as they say, continued its inevitable work, smoothing rough edges, allowing perspectives that only distance brings. Helena lived each day as if it were a gift, because she finally understood that it was exactly that, a gift not guaranteed, not promised, but precious in its temporality. She traveled to places she had always dreamed of seeing, met people who expanded her worldview, donated time and money to causes that touched her heart, and in the process, became the woman she had always had the potential to be, but never allowed. Roberto continued his routine of work and therapy, not always exploding, better controlling appearances, but never truly transformed, just more careful in hiding who he was. Patricia remained by his side, witnessing the changes, supporting when he deserved support, establishing boundaries when necessary. And Tiago grew between these two worlds, loving both his parents and his grandmother, learning from everyone's mistakes, promising himself to be better, to do better, when it came his turn to navigate the complexities of adult life. 5 years after that Sunday that changed everything, Helena Santos looked back on her journey with a mixture of emotions that could not be easily categorized. There was pain, no doubt, the wound of filial betrayal, never completely healing. There was anger, especially in the first few months, a burning fury at the injustice of what she had suffered. But there was also liberation, a freedom that came from finally living for herself, from recognizing that her worth wasn't in how much she sacrificed for others, but in how she honored herself. The money she had accumulated, that $1,200,000 that Roberto would never merely receive, became not a symbol of greed or withholding, but of self-determination, of a woman deciding the fate of her own work. When Helena finally allowed herself to look honestly at the whole experience, she recognized a painful but liberating truth. Sometimes the people we love most hurt us most deeply, and it's okay to step away, to establish boundaries, to choose oneself over even a child. This revelation, so simple yet so revolutionary for someone raised, believing that maternal love meant endless sacrifice, was perhaps the greatest gift that terrible experience had given her. And so life went on, neither with a perfectly happy ending nor tragically sad, but with the real complexity that characterizes genuine existences. Helena lived her remaining years with joy and purpose, surrounded by friends she chose, causes she embraced, experiences she finally allowed herself to have. Roberto worked daily to be better, never forgetting his crime against his mother, carrying that weight not as an excuse, but as a constant reminder to never return to that place. Tiago grew up strong and aware, learning from all the adults around him what to do and what to avoid. And the money, that $1,200,000 that had catalyzed so much pain and change, continued doing good in the world, not through direct inheritance to someone who didn't deserve it, but through intentional choices to help those who truly needed it. In the end, Helena Santos proved that it's never too late to stand up for your own worth, that consequences are necessary for bad actions, and that sometimes the greatest act of love we can have is not unconditional forgiveness, but establishing boundaries that protect our dignity and humanity. The price of humiliation, she discovered, was too high to pay, and she refused to continue paying it, choosing instead to charge the price to those who caused the humiliation, a decision not of revenge, but of justice, not of anger, but of self-respect, not of hatred, but of self-love finally conquered. 5.5 years after that Sunday that changed everything, Roberto received a call he expected, but that still left him paralyzed. Helena Santos had passed away at 70, peacefully in her sleep, without pain, surrounded by the peace she had built in the last years of her life. The funeral was small, intimate, and Roberto noticed with bitterness how many people were there, friends he had never met, faces that showed genuine love for the mother he had lost. Patricia and Tiago were by his side, but there was a visible distance, as if they were there out of obligation and not for comfort. 3 days after the burial, Roberto received a summons from Dr. Marcos for the reading of the will. Before that, Rosa and Carmen had emptied Helena's house according to instructions left by their friend, collecting personal belongings and preparing the property for sale. It was Rosa who found the leather folder behind the wedding picture. Helena had left written instructions in the will itself about where to look, and delivered it sealed to the lawyer along with the house keys. "She said you would know what to do," Rosa explained to Dr. Marcos, who kept everything in the office safe. Roberto went to the reading with contained expectation, a small voice whispering that maybe she had changed her mind, maybe she had left something for him. The lawyer's office was full. Rosa, Carmen, representatives from charities, and Tiago, already 17 years old. Dr. Marcos read the will methodically. $500,000 in a trust fund for Tiago at 25 years old, $300,000 for domestic violence support organizations, $150,000 for church social programs, $50,000 for an orphanage, $50,000 for Rosa, $50,000 for Carmen. The house where Helena had lived would be sold, and the value obtained, Dr. Marcos estimated, between $80,000 and $100,000, would be divided equally among the same charities, with him handling the sale in the following months. The rest of the money would cover funeral expenses and legal costs. Roberto's name was not mentioned once. Rosa put her hand to her chest upon hearing her name, tears silently flowing. I didn't need this, she whispered to Carmen beside her. I gained so much just having her as a friend. Carmen nodded in agreement, her own eyes watery, both understanding that this money wasn't just inheritance, but final recognition of friendships that had sustained Helena in her darkest moments. For Roberto Santos, Dr. Marcos finally said, "Your mother left only this," and handed him a sealed envelope. With trembling hands, Roberto opened and began to read the letter that Helena had written years before. Her last communication with the son who had hurt her so deeply. The letter explained everything. The merchant parents killed in an accident when she was 2 months pregnant. The $850,000 inherited. The conscious decision to raise her son without knowing about the fortune to teach him values. The signs he had given throughout his life that he didn't deserve it. The test he had repeatedly failed. For 38 years you walked past the truth about more than $1 million, Helena had written, hidden behind the wedding picture in the living room. Remember that picture, Roberto? The black and white photo that you saw every day but never really looked at? Behind it, attached with tape, a leather folder with documents, bank statements, and investment certificates that represented your financial freedom. The proof of fortune was so close, inches away from you. But you never knew, because you never deserved to know. Roberto felt the world spin, the room disappearing around him as he processed that revelation. The picture, that damn picture that he had walked past thousands, tens of thousands of times. If you had been a decent person, the letter continued, if you had shown character, humility, kindness at any point in your life, I would have told you. I would have given everything to you with joy. But you never were. And when you finally kicked me demanding money that was literally inches away from you, you confirmed everything I always knew but never wanted to accept, that my son was not a good person. Roberto read the last words through tears that weren't of regret, but of pure, distilled loss. You could have been rich, Roberto. You could have had everything. But for that, you only needed to have been good, and you never were. He crumpled the letter in his hands, his body trembling not from sadness for his dead mother, but from rage for everything he had lost, for the fortune that had been so close, for the life he could have had. Tiago watched him from across the room with an expression that mixed pity and contempt. The 17-year-old boy had matured greatly in the last 5 years, visiting his grandmother monthly without his father, learning from her about responsibility, character, and the difference between having money and having value. He knew that in 8 years he would receive $500,000, not for being a grandson, but for representing hope that the next generation would be better, for being everything his father never managed to be. I'll use this money to help other people, he had promised his grandmother on his last visit. The way you did. And Helena had died, knowing that at least in this, her legacy was secured. Patricia found him 10 minutes later, still leaning on the car, the crumpled letter on the ground. She picked it up, smoothed it out, and read it in silence. When she finished, she looked at her husband not with anger, but with a cold clarity that Roberto had never seen before. She was right about you, Patricia said calmly, folding the letter and putting it in her purse. I stayed all these years because I hoped you would truly change. But this letter, she knew you better than I did. Roberto raised his face, his eyes red. What are you saying? Patricia took a deep breath. I'm saying I'll stay until Tiago finishes high school at the end of the year. After that, I'm leaving. You can keep the house, the print shop, everything. I just want my freedom. And in that moment, Roberto realized that he had lost not only his mother's fortune, but also the last person who still believed in him. 6 months later, when Tiago graduated, Patricia kept her promise. She left home taking only her clothes and half the furniture, leaving Roberto alone with the failing print shop and the weight of all his choices. And in that moment, Roberto Santos finally understood the bitterest truth of all: that his mother hadn't deprived him of fortune out of cruelty, but that he himself had deprived himself of it by being exactly who he was, and that this, more than anything else, was unforgivable because it meant he had no one to blame but himself. The irony would slowly destroy him over his remaining years. That image of the painting on the wall, so simple, so obvious, so impossible to forget, an eternal reminder of everything he could have had if only he had been a better man.